Good evening. Nearly 200 years ago, an English poet wrote these lines. Ill fares the land to hastening ills a prey, where wealth accumulates and men decay. What brought these lines to my mind were two very significant events which have taken place in Canada in recent weeks. The first was the march to Ottawa of a delegation of Western farmers to ask for deficiency payments. The other has been the legislation introduced in the legislatures of Newfoundland and British Columbia regarding trade unions. Let's look at these two very important happenings. First of all, there was the march of the Western farmers to Ottawa. Even though they didn't get what they went to secure, I think that the march was worthwhile, if it did nothing else than to bring to the attention of the people of Canada the problem of the prairie farmer who is caught in a cost-price squeeze. Nevertheless, I know that those who went on this delegation were disappointed, because in spite of the fact that the Prime Minister made a lengthy and a flowery speech, he gave little or no indication that the farmers are likely to get deficiency payments. And this comes rather strange from the Prime Minister, since he is the man who on the 12th of March 1956 introduced a resolution into the House of Commons calling upon the Liberal government of that day to immediately introduce parity prices. And you remember that he finished his speech with that eloquent phrase, "What the farmers of this country want is not charity, but parity." Well, I'm afraid on March the 10th of this year, the farmers not only didn't get parity from the Prime Minister, they didn't even get much charity. I wonder if you listened to the report, the capital report from the CBC in Ottawa on the Sunday following the march to Ottawa. I wonder if you listened to Mr. Peter Stursberg. I was particularly interested in what he said because for some months Mr. Stursberg has been the publicity agent for the Progressive Conservative Party, and therefore he's not at all likely to say anything which would be detrimental to the federal government. Commenting on the march to Ottawa, Mr. Stursberg said two things. First, he said the delegates were surprised and irked by the fact that they got so little support from the Western members. They had expected some hostility from the Eastern members, but they were surprised at the opposition from the Prairie MPs, and they were astonished that they knew so little about deficiency payments. Well, this is not surprising. After all, we have had here in Western Canada for many years some fine champions and spokesmen for the West. I think of a man like M.J. Coldwell, and whether you agree with his politics or not, there can be no doubt about his ability as a spokesman for the West and his courage and integrity in expressing the point of view of the Western farmer. I think of people like Mervyn Johnson and Max Campbell and Roy Knight. I think of Sandy Nicholson and Hugh Castleton and Ed McCullough and Claude Ellis and Scoop Lurie. I think of Stan Knowles and Scotty Bryce and Alistair Stewart and many others who year in and year out presented the case for the West. But in the last federal election, just about a year ago, the people of the prairies left these men behind and elected men whom most people have never heard of before, and I may say haven't heard from since. The result is that when this question of deficiency payments comes on the floor of the House, there will be only one man who will put up a battle for the Western farmer, and that is Hazen Argue, the CCF MP. Even Mr. Lester Pearson, the leader of the opposition, has refused to come out and support deficiency payments. He told the delegates that he was in favor of the farmer having a better income, but he would not commit himself to supporting either parity prices or deficiency payments. I think we ought to learn something from this. When we go out to cast our vote, remember we're voting for keeps. We're electing a government for 4 years. Someone has said that people get the kind of government they deserve. And if we allow ourselves to be influenced and swayed by some slogan such as "Give John a chance," instead of voting to give ourselves and our children a chance, then of course we have to put up with that kind of representation for another 4 or 5 years. And if we are not well represented in Parliament when this deficiency payment question is being discussed, I think we have only ourselves to thank for that fact. The other thing which Mr. Stursberg said that was of interest to me was that the government didn't have to pay too much attention to the delegation because farmers didn't represent as many people as they used to. And of course it's true. At the turn of the century, the farmers represented over 50% of the population of Canada. Now farmers represent 14% of the population of Canada, only 1 in 7. And so Mr. Stursberg says, the government doesn't consider the farming vote quite as important as it used to be. Well, what's the lesson we learn from this? Isn't it this simple fact that the farmer must now seek allies? Who's he going to ally himself with? It wouldn't be the Manufacturers Association, or the Mortgage Companies Association, or the Bankers Association. Surely the only group with whom the farmers can ally themselves are the working people of Canada, the people who work in the forests and in the factories, in the stores, in the schoolroom, in the office. So that all the people who labor and toil in Canada, wherever they may be, in whatever form, will come together in order to get a new deal for the Canadian people, in order that our economy will be planned in the interests of those who toil, rather than in the interests, as it has been up till now, in the interests of those who live by clipping coupons or who live off dividends on their industrial stock. And that brings me to the second important event which has taken place, namely the labor legislation introduced in the provinces of Newfoundland and British Columbia. Now, all this discussion in Newfoundland about Jimmy Hoffa and the labor racketeers in the United States is, to my mind, just a smokescreen. What are the facts? The facts are that the International Woodworkers of America came in to organize the loggers of Newfoundland more than 2 years ago. The Labor Relations Board of Newfoundland certified this union after a government-supervised vote in which over 90% of the loggers, by secret ballot, indicated they wanted the IWA to act as their collective bargaining agent. A conciliation board was set up by the government, and that conciliation board brought down a report signed unanimously by all the members of the board, including the company's representative. And that report recommended that the men should get their hours reduced from 60 hours to 54 hours a week. That they should get a 5-cent an hour increase, not this year, but starting in 1960. Now, surely those aren't very generous terms. And if you happened to see Mr. Pickersgill on press conference the other evening, you will remember that when someone asked him if he thought these terms were too generous and the company was therefore justified in refusing them, he said no. The company didn't refuse because of these terms, but because of the fact that the union might in the future make exorbitant demands. Now, surely this is a new principle of collective bargaining, that a company should reject the request of a union and the report of a conciliation board, not because it's too much, but because in the future they may ask too much. Now, the company rejected the conciliation board report, despite the fact that its own representative on that board had signed the recommendations. Well, of course, a strike ensued, and it went on for many, many weeks. And the Prime Minister or Premier of Newfoundland, Mr. Smallwood, became concerned about it because, after all, the lumber industry affects about 1/3 of the economy of Newfoundland. Now, Mr. Smallwood could quite easily have brought both parties together. He could have said to them, unless you resolve your difficulties, I'm not going to let you ruin the economy of Newfoundland. I'll call the legislature together and set up an arbitration machinery. But he didn't do that. Instead of that, the Premier of Newfoundland set about establishing a company union. And when he couldn't get enough loggers to join the company union, he introduced legislation decertifying the IWA. Now, if the IWA was breaking the law, there are methods of dealing with unions who break the law. If there was good grounds for decertifying them, there's the machinery for doing that. You can do one of two things. The government could have gone to the courts and given evidence in the courts that the IWA was acting unlawfully and illegally, and the courts could have decertified the union, but the men would have had a right to appear in the courts and present their case. Or if, as Mr. Smallwood said, the majority of the loggers didn't want any longer to belong to the IWA, the government could have arranged a supervised vote, and the loggers by secret ballot could have voted to decertify the union. But neither of these courses were taken. Instead of that, Mr. Smallwood introduced legislation decertifying the union, and the legislature became the judge and the jury. And the men were no longer allowed to have their chosen union as their bargaining agent. Now, this is striking at the very roots of democratic government. This is what dictators have always done. When they wanted to destroy freedom, they began by taking away the right of men and women to select their own collective bargaining agent. When we move over to British Columbia, we're noticing something which is equally sinister. Certain rights of picketing being taken away from workers on strike, and more serious, legislation saying that trade unions are now legal entities and can be sued in the courts. What does this mean? It means that if a union goes on strike, a number of companies can go to the courts and claim that their business is being interfered with, that traffic is being interfered with, that goods aren't moving, and therefore their revenues have been impaired, and they can sue the union. Imagine the plight of a union that has half a dozen companies, each sue it for $1 million. Even if they don't collect the $1 million, the expenses of the court, the constant battling in the courts. This could mean, of course, the end of trade unions. And don't forget that at the turn of the century, big business tried this very same thing in Great Britain. And the workers became so alarmed at the threat to their basic democratic rights that, as you know, they formed the British Labour Party. And I hope that the workers of this country will begin to realize that their hard-won rights are now in jeopardy, and that they need now not only to close their own ranks, but that workers and farmers in this country need to come together to fight a common battle for social justice and for economic equity. And we in the CCF say that the CCF is the logical medium by which these different groups can come together. Farmers and workers have a common affinity. They depend on each other's purchasing power. They have a common objective to have a planned economy designed to serve the interests of the ordinary people. And we say that they must come together and should come together in the CCF. Because we in the CCF believe that we shouldn't have wealth accumulating and men decaying. We believe that men are more important than money, that people are more important than profits. We believe the first consideration in our society should be humanity first. I began with an English poet. Let me close with a few lines from an American poet, Edwin Markham, who said, "Clear the way then, clear the way. Blind creeds and kings have had their day. Move the dead branches from out the path. Our hope is in the aftermath. Our hope is in heroic men, star-led to build the world again. To this event all ages ran. Make way for brotherhood. Make way for man." Good night, and thank you for listening.